She thought marrying a hardworking man would finally calm her family's fears. They had watched her struggle for years. Cross borders. Carry responsibility that wasn't hers alone. So when she told them she was getting married, they didn't ask who he was. They asked why she would choose another life of work. She learned early that nothing in her life would arrive gently. Not opportunities. Not rest. Not love. Everything would have to be earned the hard way, quietly, consistently, without anyone noticing how tired she was. By the time she moved across borders for work, exhaustion already felt familiar. It sat in her bones like a second language. Something she no longer questioned. Something she carried the way other people carried hope. Her mornings began before the city decided to wake up. The apartment she rented was small, shared, and temporary in the way migrant housing always was. Furniture that didn't belong to anyone, walls that remembered no one, windows that looked out but never invited you in. She dressed in silence, careful not to wake the others. Not because they asked her to, but because consideration had become instinct. Outside, the air was colder than her hometown had ever been. She walked to work with the same pace every day. Not rushing. Not lingering. A pace that suggested reliability. Employers noticed that. Reliability was the closest thing to respect she'd learned how to offer. At work, her hands moved faster than her thoughts. She learned tasks by watching once. She stayed later without being asked. When something went wrong, she fixed it before it could be blamed on her. Not because she was afraid, but because fear wasted time. People described her as easy to work with. They never said driven. Never said ambitious. Those words belonged to people who were allowed to want more. Her family back home believed she was doing well. She made sure of that. Every call was filtered. Every detail edited. She spoke about work as if it were stable, predictable, almost gentle. She never mentioned the aches that followed her into sleep. Or the way loneliness crept in when routines ended. When money arrived, she sent most of it back. Not out of obligation, but relief. Relief that her effort translated into something tangible. A roof repaired. A sibling's tuition paid. A medical bill erased before it could grow teeth. This, she believed, was success. Not comfort. Control. She didn't believe in romanticizing struggle. She believed in surviving it efficiently. That was why she noticed him. Not because he was charming. Not because he stood out. But because he worked the way she did. He arrived early. He left when the work was done. He didn't complain. He didn't perform gratitude. They worked in different roles, close enough to notice habits, distant enough to avoid conversation. At first, she only registered his presence the way one registers a consistent sound, background, reliable, unremarkable. Until one day, something small happened. A problem that usually caused delays didn't. A process that normally required approval moved forward without friction. She noticed, adjusted her workflow, and kept going. Then it happened again. And again. Nothing dramatic. No favors she could point to. Just a subtle smoothing of edges in a system that usually resisted her. She didn't ask questions. You don't question things that make your life easier when you've spent years accepting difficulty as default. Their first real conversation happened late. End of shift. Almost empty space. She was packing up when he spoke, casually, as if continuing a discussion they'd already been having. You always stay until the last task is finished, he said. She paused, surprised. I like things completed, she replied. He nodded. It shows. That was it. No flirtation. No invitation. Just recognition. After that, they spoke occasionally. Brief exchanges. Observations about work. Practical comments. They shared an understanding that didn't require elaboration. He never asked her where she was from. She appreciated that. Instead, he asked about how long she planned to stay. Long enough, she said. He smiled, not at her, but at the answer. As if it confirmed something he already suspected. She didn't know much about him. He kept his life carefully minimal. No stories about family. No complaints about management. No signs of aspiration beyond doing the work well. That made him familiar. That made him safe. When he offered to walk her part of the way home one evening, it didn't feel like an advance. It felt logistical. The street lighting was inconsistent. The hour late. They walked side by side, not close. Conversation came easily because it didn't try to be anything else. They talked about schedules. About which grocery stores stayed open late. About sleep patterns shaped by work instead of desire. At her building, she stopped. "This is me." He nodded. "See you tomorrow." No hesitation. No lingering. That night, she slept without replaying the day. That alone felt significant. Weeks passed. Then months. Their connection grew the way practical things did, incrementally, almost invisibly. Shared lunches that happened to overlap. Adjusted schedules that aligned without discussion. A rhythm that formed not from intention, but compatibility. He never spoke about the future. She liked that. The future had always demanded too much explanation. When she told her family she was seeing someone, she kept it simple. "He works hard," she said. "He understands my schedule." Her mother paused. "Is he stable?" "Yes." "Kind?" "Yes." "Enough?" She hesitated, then answered honestly. "Yes." That was all they asked. At that stage, that was all she needed to know. She didn't fall in love quickly. She trusted slowly. And trust, for her, was always the bigger risk. Love didn't arrive in her life like a revelation. It arrived the way everything else had. Gradually. Quietly. Through repetition. They didn't start spending time together because they were trying to build something. It happened because their routines kept overlapping. Lunch breaks that aligned. Commutes that ran in the same direction. A shared understanding that free time was limited and rest was earned. Being together never felt like an interruption. That was new for her. Most relationships she had known demanded energy she didn't have. Conversations that required enthusiasm. Expectations she couldn't afford. Emotions that arrived loudly and wanted to be managed. With him, there was none of that. They talked the way people talk when they aren't trying to impress each other. About what hurt after work. About how long it took to feel human again after a long shift. About the small calculations they made every day just to keep life running smoothly. Sometimes they didn't talk at all. They sat side by side on public benches, sharing food they bought cheaply, watching the city move without them. She noticed how comfortable silence felt with him, not empty, not awkward. Just shared. That mattered more than romance ever had. He never tried to rescue her from her life. That mattered even more. When she stayed late, he didn't complain. When she canceled plans, he didn't take it personally. When she talked about money, he listened without judgment or fantasy. Once, after a particularly long day, she mentioned sending another transfer home. "Does it ever feel like too much?" he asked. She considered the question carefully. "No," she said. "It feels necessary." He nodded. "That makes sense." No advice. No correction. Just acceptance. They started spending weekends together, not going places, but doing things. Groceries. Laundry. Errands that felt lighter when shared. They learned each other's habits through practicality. She learned he folded clothes neatly but didn't care where they went. He learned she lined up her shoes every night without realizing it. These weren't the kinds of details people bragged about. They were the kinds you trusted. When he stayed over for the first time, it wasn't planned. It wasn't romantic. It was late, raining, inconvenient. He slept on the far side of the bed, careful not to take up space. She noticed that too. In the morning, he woke early and made coffee without asking. Not fancy. Just functional. She watched him move around the kitchen and felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Not excitement. Stability. They didn't talk about commitment for a long time. They didn't need to. Commitment revealed itself in consistency. In showing up the same way every day. In choosing ease over ego. In not disappearing when things got heavy. One evening, she told him about her family. Not the edited version. The real one. The expectations. The sacrifices. The fear of repeating struggle. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said only one thing. They're afraid of you being tired forever. The accuracy startled her. Yes, she said quietly. He didn't argue with that fear. He respected it. That was when she realized something important. He wasn't trying to be different from her past. He was compatible with it. They talked about marriage for the first time on an ordinary night. No candles. No announcement. They were sitting on the floor, backs against the couch, paperwork spread between them. Bills. Schedules. Plans that lived a few months ahead, not years. I don't think I want something complicated, she said, almost to herself. He glanced at her. Neither do I. She hesitated. I want a life where work stays work. He thought about it. That sounds reasonable. Reasonable. She had never associated that word with love before. But now, it felt right. She imagined a future with him the way she imagined stability, not as happiness promised, but as pressure reduced. Fewer uncertainties. Fewer explanations. A shared pace. She told her family about him properly not long after. Her mother asked careful questions. Her father stayed quiet longer than usual. What does he do? Her sister asked. He works, she said. He's reliable. And his plans? Her mother pressed. She answered honestly. He doesn't make promises he can't keep. There was a pause on the line. That's good, her mother said eventually. Just, make sure it's enough. Enough. The word lingered. With him, she never felt rushed toward a decision. That, paradoxically, made her certain. When he asked her to marry him, it wasn't dramatic. They were walking home after a long day. The city was loud. Ordinary. I don't know how to make big speeches, he said. But I know I work better when you're there. She smiled. I work better when I'm not alone, she replied. That was their agreement. They didn't celebrate loudly. They didn't announce it widely. They started planning the way they did everything else, carefully, practically, without illusions. She believed she had chosen well. She believed love, at its best, should feel like support, not spectacle. What she didn't know yet was that her family wasn't worried about whether he loved her. They were worried about what kind of life that love would lock her into. And whether she had worked too hard to choose struggle again. Her family didn't reject him immediately. That came later. At first, it was quieter than that. Softer. Wrapped in concern instead of anger. They asked questions the way people do when they're already worried, but still hoping to be reassured. How long had they been together? Where did he see himself in 5 years? Did he plan to stay in the same line of work? Each question carried weight. Not because of what it asked, but because of what it assumed. She answered patiently. Carefully. The way she always had when dealing with family matters. She didn't exaggerate his qualities. She didn't hide his limitations. She believed honesty was the strongest position. He's steady, she said. He's responsible. He doesn't take risks he can't afford. Her father listened without interrupting, his face unreadable. Her mother nodded slowly, absorbing every word. Her sister, though, didn't bother hiding her skepticism. "Is that really enough?" she asked. "After everything you've done?" The question landed harder than it should have. It wasn't about him. It was about her past. About the years she had worked through exhaustion. About missed holidays. About the sacrifices that had shaped her into the family's quiet success story. They didn't see her choice as love. They saw it as regression. Her mother didn't raise her voice. She never did. Disappointment, when delivered calmly, carried more force. "We just don't want you struggling forever," she said. "You've already paid your share." That night, after the call ended, she sat alone longer than usual. She wasn't angry. She was tired. Tired of love being measured by outcomes instead of connection. Tired of her life being treated like an investment that needed a strong return. When she told him about the conversation, she expected him to be offended. He wasn't. "They're trying to protect you," he said simply. "You don't feel insulted?" she asked. He shook his head. "I'd be more worried if they didn't care." That response should have reassured her. Instead, it made things heavier. Because he wasn't fighting back. As the weeks passed, the pressure increased, not dramatically, but persistently. Her mother started sending articles. Stories about people who married potential and paid the price. Conversations drifted toward stability, benefits, futures that required leverage. Her father asked once, quietly, "Does he plan to move up?" She hesitated before answering. "He plans to do his job well." The silence on the other end told her that wasn't the answer he was hoping for. Her family wanted certainty. Not emotional certainty. Economic certainty. They began referring to him indirectly. Not by name. Just as, "the situation." "Have you thought more about the situation? Is the situation temporary? What if the situation limits you?" Each time, she defended him. But each defense chipped away at her energy. She began noticing things she hadn't before. How often she felt the need to explain him. How she softened descriptions to make him sound safer. How she avoided certain details to prevent further questions. At night, she lay awake wondering when love started feeling like a negotiation. The invitation to dinner came shortly after. Her parents wanted to meet him properly. Not casually. Formally. She told him about it while they were cleaning up after dinner, hands still damp from dishwater. "They want to see you," she said. He looked up, already understanding what that meant. "Are they worried?" he asked. "Yes." "About me?" She nodded. He didn't smile. But he didn't withdraw either. "When?" he asked. That evening, she noticed something shift. Not in his affection, but in his awareness. He listened more closely when she talked about family dynamics. Asked questions he hadn't asked before. Not to prepare defenses, but to understand the rules of the room he was about to enter. She appreciated that. The dinner was polite. Too polite. Her mother served carefully. Her father asked measured questions. Her sister observed more than she spoke. He answered honestly. Without embellishment. Without pretending to be more than he was. And somehow, that honesty unsettled them more than arrogance ever could. He didn't offer big plans. He didn't sell ambition. He spoke about responsibility, about learning through work, about valuing consistency over recognition. When the evening ended, everyone smiled. But no one relaxed. After he left, her mother sighed. Not dramatically, just enough. "He seems kind," she said. "But kindness doesn't protect you from exhaustion." Her father nodded. "You deserve more options." That word again. Deserve. As if love were a reward for suffering. As if marriage were a promotion. She didn't argue that night. She didn't have the strength. Later, alone with him, she apologized. "For what?" he asked. For putting you in the middle. You didn't, he said. I walked there willingly. She studied his face. They think you'll hold me back. He considered that carefully. And what do you think? She answered without hesitation. I think you understand me. He smiled gently. That might be what scares them. The wedding planning became complicated after that. Not because of money, but because of meaning. Every suggestion from her family carried implication. Bigger venues. Better timing. Strategic considerations disguised as generosity. They weren't trying to stop the marriage. They were trying to reshape it into something safer. She felt herself splitting into roles again. Daughter. Partner. Mediator. And somewhere in that division, doubt crept in, not about him, but about whether love alone could survive this kind of scrutiny. She noticed how easily power entered conversations when love wasn't considered enough. What she didn't know yet was that the imbalance her family feared already existed. Just not in the direction they imagined. The pressure didn't arrive loudly. It narrowed. At some point, it stopped feeling like concern shared by everyone and began to feel like something more focused, more deliberate. It came from one voice, repeating the same idea in different forms. Her mother. The call came in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, during a break that was supposed to give her rest. Instead, it carried weight she didn't have time to prepare for. Her mother didn't mention him right away. She talked about health, about how time moves faster than people expect, about how exhaustion has a way of pretending it's normal. Only then did she speak about the future. Not emotionally. Practically. She framed it as permission to stop surviving, permission to choose ease after years of effort. As if love were something that required justification only when it didn't promise comfort. They weren't asking her to leave him. That distinction mattered to her mother. It made the request sound reasonable. Gentle. Responsible. They suggested time. Postponement. Space to see whether things improved on their own. What went unsaid was louder than anything spoken. If nothing changes, you'll eventually have to. When the call ended, she didn't feel angry. She felt repositioned. As if her life had quietly shifted from something she was living into something being evaluated. That night, she didn't tell him what had been said. Not because she wanted to hide it, but because saying it out loud would turn suggestion into reality. But something had changed. She began noticing the way he handled pressure. How he absorbed it without reaction. How he didn't resist discomfort, didn't argue, didn't push back when others crossed invisible lines. What once felt grounding now felt measured. She wondered, briefly, whether calm could be learned the same way survival was. A few days later, her sister reached out, not to criticize, but to offer alternatives. The kind that came disguised as care. She declined quickly, decisively. But the fact that options were being presented at all lingered longer than she expected. For the first time, she felt her relationship being placed beside other possibilities, not because it was weak, but because it was deemed insufficient. When she finally told him about the call, she expected reaction. Concern. Frustration. Something. Instead, he listened quietly, then asked what she wanted to do. Not what they should do. What she wanted. She said she didn't want to postpone her life. She didn't want to negotiate love into something more acceptable. He didn't challenge that. He accepted it without resistance. And that acceptance unsettled her more than disagreement ever could. Because for the first time, she felt entirely alone inside the decision. As the days passed, she became aware of things she had never questioned before. Not lies, just absences. The way he spoke about work without trajectory. The way conversations about the future ended cleanly, without friction. The way he seemed prepared for uncertainty, not threatened by it. She asked once if he ever wanted more. His answer was thoughtful. Calm. Reasonable. And deeply unsatisfying. It didn't contradict her fears. It simply didn't engage with them. The second dinner with her parents was framed as planning. Venues. Logistics. Details that carried emotional undertones no one acknowledged openly. Halfway through, her parents offered help. Generous help. Help that assumed instability. She noticed how easily assistance turned into leverage, how quickly concern became a quiet measure of worth. When her father spoke about providing a future, the room held its breath. This time, he didn't deflect. He didn't soften. He said he already was. The certainty in his voice disrupted something. Not just for her parents, but for her. It was the first time his calm felt anchored in something unseen. Not passive. Not defensive. Contained. Her mother looked at him differently then. Not with judgment, but reassessment. That night, she confronted him gently, not with accusation but confusion. She told him he sounded different. More certain than usual. He said he didn't lie to her. She believed him. And that belief made everything harder. Because she was beginning to understand that honesty didn't always mean transparency. That someone could tell the truth and still withhold shape. As the wedding approached, the fracture didn't grow louder. It sharpened. She realized that loving someone without knowing everything about them wasn't the problem. The problem was choosing them while realizing that power, economic, social, invisible, was already in the room. Just not where her family thought it was. The first sign wasn't dramatic. It didn't arrive as a discovery or a confession. It showed up quietly, the way imbalance always does, through moments that didn't quite line up with the story she thought she understood. It began with something small. A delay. He was late one evening, later than usual, and when he arrived, he didn't look exhausted. Not refreshed either. Just composed. As if his day had demanded attention, not labor. She noticed it without commenting. That was how she had learned to observe, carefully, without interrupting the surface of things. Over the following weeks, those moments accumulated. Not enough to form accusations. Just enough to form questions. Sometimes he received calls he didn't answer immediately. Not out of secrecy, but out of timing. He would glance at the screen, consider it, then let it pass. When she asked who it was, he answered honestly. Work. But work began to sound less like a place and more like a boundary. She realized she didn't actually know where his limits were. Only that he seemed unusually prepared for pressure. Not reactive. Not strained. Prepared. It contrasted sharply with her world. Her days were predictable in their exhaustion. Every decision carried weight. Every plan required adjustment. She knew exactly what she could afford to lose. He moved differently. Not carelessly, but without visible calculation. Once, while reviewing their wedding expenses, she hesitated over a number. She suggested cutting back. He agreed immediately. Too easily. No negotiation. No relief. No tension. She looked up at him then, trying to read his face. He wasn't uncomfortable. He wasn't relieved either. It was as if the number itself didn't matter. That should have comforted her. Instead, it unsettled her. Another moment came when an issue arose with her work permit. A complication that could take weeks, maybe months, to resolve. She told him about it late at night, bracing herself for concern. He listened. Then he asked a few precise questions. Not emotional ones. Practical ones. When she finished explaining, he said, calmly, that it would be handled. Not, we'll figure it out. Handled. The certainty in his voice startled her. How? She asked. He paused. There are ways, he said. You won't have to carry this alone. The words were kind. But they carried an assumption she hadn't agreed to yet. She didn't press him. She told herself she was overthinking. That stability often looks strange when you're used to precarity. Still, she began noticing how others reacted to him. At a small gathering, someone asked what he did. He answered simply. But the way he answered, without defensiveness, without explanation, ended the conversation instead of inviting it. People didn't question him. They adjusted. She noticed how service staff responded. How schedules seemed to shift subtly when he spoke. How inconveniences dissolved without effort. None of it was obvious. That was the point. Power rarely announces itself. It operates through ease. The more she noticed, the more careful she became with her own reactions. She didn't want to turn curiosity into suspicion. She didn't want to invent distance where none existed. But the wedding preparations amplified everything. Meetings that should have been logistical became revealing. Venues that suddenly had availability. Complications that resolved themselves without explanation. Once, she asked how he managed to secure a booking that had been fully booked just days earlier. He smiled and said it worked out. She didn't push. But that night, lying awake, she realized she didn't know what worked out meant in his world. The imbalance didn't frighten her yet. What frightened her was how invisible it had been for so long. She wondered how much of her understanding of him had been shaped by assumption rather than truth. How much she had filled in with familiarity instead of clarity. When she brought up her family again, how tense things still felt, how conditional their support remained, he listened patiently. "They're measuring safety," he said. "Not love." She agreed. But then he added, "Eventually, they'll see." The phrasing caught her attention. See what? She didn't ask. Because suddenly, she was afraid of the answer. The turning point came quietly. An envelope arrived in the mail. Not addressed to him. Addressed to her. Inside was a notice, formal, official, related to a matter she hadn't discussed with anyone except him. It was resolved. Completely. No explanation. No steps outlined. Just confirmation. Her hands trembled slightly as she read it. When she showed him, he didn't look surprised. He looked relieved. Not for himself. For her. "You didn't have to do that," she said. He looked at her then, really looked. "I didn't do it for recognition," he said. "I did it so you could breathe." The intention was loving. But the method was opaque. For the first time, she felt the presence of something larger than their relationship. Not money. Not status. Influence. She realized then that the issue wasn't whether he was lying. It was whether she had ever asked the right questions. That night, she didn't confront him. She didn't accuse. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, understanding something new. She had chosen love because it felt equal. Because it felt shared. Now she wasn't sure if it still was. And she didn't yet know whether the imbalance favored him, or protected her. The truth didn't come from him. That was what made it impossible to ignore. It arrived through coincidence, wrapped in formality, delivered by people who didn't know they were changing the shape of her life. The invitation came through her workplace first. A formal notice about a mandatory briefing related to a corporate restructuring, attendance required, schedule fixed, no flexibility. She almost ignored it. Corporate language rarely had anything to do with her world. These announcements usually passed overhead, irrelevant to the daily grind. But this one didn't. The name of the company caught her attention. It was familiar. Too familiar. She had heard it before, casually, indirectly, always without context. In conversations he ended quickly. In news articles he never commented on. In moments that now returned with sharper edges. She didn't mention the invitation to him. Not out of strategy. Out of instinct. The room where the briefing was held was large, modern, and uncomfortable in its precision. Screens lined the walls. People spoke in measured tones. Authority moved through the space without urgency. She sat near the back, unnoticed, exactly where she felt safest. The presentation began with numbers. Growth. Expansion. Influence that stretched beyond borders. Then a name appeared on the screen. His name. Not the version she knew. The full one. Paired with a title that didn't require explanation. Chief Executive Officer. For a moment, she assumed there had been a mistake. That kind of mistake only exists for people who don't understand how power works. As images followed, interviews, boardroom footage, carefully curated moments, her confusion gave way to clarity. Not shock. Recognition. The calm. The access. The ease. All of it aligned. She didn't feel betrayed immediately. She felt reorganized. As if her understanding of the past had been quietly edited without her consent. When she returned home that evening, he was there, exactly as he always was. No visible difference. No preparation. No guilt. He asked how her day had been. She told him about the meeting. She told him about the presentation. She told him about the screen. He didn't deny it. He didn't explain either. He listened. When she finished, the room felt smaller. She waited for a confession. It didn't come. Instead, he said, "I should have known it would surface that way." That sentence confirmed everything. "You let me believe," she began, then stopped. He didn't interrupt her. He waited. "You let me believe we were equal," she finished. "We were," he said. The certainty in his voice wasn't defensive. It was sincere. He didn't frame his identity as deception. He framed it as context he hadn't shared. A boundary he hadn't crossed. He spoke about why he lived the way he did. About leaving rooms where power decided outcomes before people finished speaking. About wanting to exist somewhere he wasn't anticipated. He told her he didn't hide to manipulate. He hid to breathe. The explanation was calm. Reasonable. And deeply insufficient. Because what he hadn't considered was what silence had done to her. She realized, in that moment, that the imbalance her family feared had always existed. Not because he was beneath her, but because he was far above the structure she navigated every day. He had stepped down. She had climbed. They met somewhere in the middle. But only one of them could return to where they came from without consequence. She asked him one question. "How long were you going to let me believe this version of you?" He hesitated. Not because he didn't know the answer. Because the answer was complicated. "I didn't want it to matter," he said. That was the truth. And also the mistake. Because it mattered now more than it ever would have before. Her family's concerns returned with new meaning. Their fear of her choosing struggle. Their insistence on security. They had been wrong about him. But right about imbalance. She felt exposed, not because he was powerful, but because she had never been given the chance to decide how much of that power she wanted near her life. The wedding plans felt different overnight. Every detail suddenly carried weight. Every offer of help felt retroactive. Every solution now had a source she hadn't consented to. She wasn't angry. She was disoriented. Trust hadn't been broken loudly. It had been bent quietly. That night, she didn't sleep. She thought about the version of herself who fell in love with a man who understood exhaustion. Who valued routine. Who didn't interrupt her life with spectacle. She wondered if that man had ever truly existed, or if he had been a carefully maintained absence of power. In the morning, she didn't confront him. She didn't demand explanations. She asked for space. Not distance. Space. He gave it without resistance. That, somehow, hurt the most. Because she realized that power, when it loves you, doesn't cling. It waits. And waiting, she understood now, was another form of control. Space changed the shape of things. Not immediately. Not dramatically. It worked slowly, the way distance always does, by making absence louder than presence. The days after she asked for space didn't feel like separation. They felt like suspension. Nothing had ended, but nothing moved forward either. She stayed busy. Work filled the hours. Routine offered something familiar when everything else felt newly unstable. What surprised her most wasn't missing him. It was missing the version of herself she had been with him. The woman who didn't explain her exhaustion. Who didn't justify her limits. Who didn't anticipate outcomes before choosing. That version had existed because she believed she was safe from imbalance. Now, every memory replayed differently. Moments that once felt equal revealed their asymmetry. Decisions she thought were shared carried weight she hadn't known how to measure. She realized she had never asked what it meant for him to step away from power. Only what it meant for her to step into love. Her family noticed the shift immediately. Not the truth. The pause. Her mother called more often. Her voice gentler than usual, as if softness could guide her toward clarity. "We're just worried," she said again. This time, the concern didn't anger her. It frightened her. Because it aligned too easily with what she was already feeling. Her sister was more direct. "If you'd known," she asked, "would you have chosen differently?" The question lingered long after the call ended. She didn't know the answer. That uncertainty unsettled her more than any deception could have. He didn't disappear during that time. He didn't pressure her either. He respected the space exactly as she asked for it, no more, no less. That precision felt intentional. Like everything else. When they spoke, it was careful. Polite. Measured. Conversations that avoided the weight of what remained unresolved. He never defended himself. That should have made things easier. Instead, it made her feel alone with the consequences of knowledge she hadn't asked for. She began to understand something uncomfortable. Power doesn't argue. It waits. She saw it in the way her problems dissolved quietly. Bills adjusted themselves. Obstacles softened around her without discussion. She didn't ask for help. But it arrived anyway. Not as a gift. As infrastructure. And infrastructure, she realized, doesn't ask for consent once it's in place. The hardest moment came unexpectedly. She ran into someone from her workplace, a manager she barely interacted with, who mentioned him casually. With respect. Not personal respect. Institutional respect. The way people speak about authority without needing to explain why. She smiled politely and excused herself, heart racing. It wasn't jealousy or anger she felt. It was displacement. She no longer knew where she stood in the story of her own life. Was she his partner? Or his proximity? That night, she opened the notebook she had used for planning. Budgets. Schedules. Shared responsibilities. Everything felt theoretical now. Because none of it accounted for power she hadn't chosen but couldn't escape. She wrote one question at the top of a blank page. Can love survive if it isn't equal? The answer didn't come. She thought about the sacrifices she had made to build autonomy. The years spent refusing help that came with conditions. The pride she carried quietly, not as arrogance, but as survival. She wondered whether accepting his world meant surrendering that autonomy. Or redefining it. When they finally met again, it wasn't dramatic. They chose a neutral place. A public space. Somewhere neither of them controlled. She spoke first. Not with accusation. With clarity. She told him she didn't know how to exist inside a relationship where one person could reshape reality and the other had to navigate it. She told him she needed to know whether equality was possible, or if it had only ever been an illusion. He listened without interruption. Then, for the first time since the truth surfaced, he spoke about cost. Not financial. Personal. He talked about what it meant to step away from visibility. From authority that decided outcomes before effort mattered. He told her power had always isolated him. That what he wanted from her wasn't admiration, but normalcy. She believed him. And that belief frightened her too. Because it meant the conflict wasn't about lies or intent. It was about compatibility. They didn't resolve anything that day. They acknowledged the fracture. That was all. As they parted, she realized something quietly devastating. Love hadn't disappeared. But certainty had. And certainty, she was beginning to understand, was the foundation she had built everything else on. The choice didn't arrive as a declaration. It came as an understanding. Not sudden. Not emotional. But steady, the way decisions that last usually are. She realized she wasn't deciding whether she loved him. That part had already survived uncertainty, distance, and truth. What she was deciding was the shape of her life. For days after their last conversation, she returned to routine. Not to escape the question, but to see how it felt to exist without answering it. Work remained demanding. The city remained indifferent. Her responsibilities didn't soften simply because her world had grown more complicated. And that clarity mattered. Because it reminded her of something essential. Her life had always been built through effort, not rescue. She met her mother for coffee one morning. Not to explain. To listen. Her mother spoke carefully, choosing words that balanced love with fear. She admitted she had been wrong about him, not about his intentions, but about his position. "I was afraid you'd choose struggle," her mother said quietly. She nodded. "I did," she replied. "But it was my choice." The distinction settled between them. For the first time, her mother didn't argue. Later that week, she met him again. Not in a neutral place this time. In her space. Where her routines lived. Where her life looked ordinary and unremarkable to anyone who expected spectacle. He arrived without entourage. Without adjustment. Without the subtle shifts that followed him elsewhere. She noticed that too. They sat across from each other, not as adversaries, not as lovers trying to convince, but as two people negotiating reality. She told him she couldn't build a life where solutions appeared without consent. Where power hovered invisibly, shaping outcomes before effort had a chance. She told him love, for her, required friction. Required limitation. Required the freedom to fail without intervention. He listened. And then, finally, he responded, not with justification, but with surrender. He told her what he could offer. Not control. Not insulation. Choice. He offered boundaries. Transparency. A willingness to let her struggle when she chose to, and to support her only when invited. Not as a test. As a principle. She didn't answer immediately. Because this time, she wasn't reacting. She was choosing. She asked him one final question. "Can you live a life where you don't fix things?" He smiled, not confidently, but honestly. "I can learn," he said. That answer mattered more than any promise. The wedding didn't become extravagant. It didn't become strategic. It became intentional. They chose a smaller ceremony. Fewer guests. A structure that reflected neither sacrifice nor spectacle. Her family attended, not entirely convinced, but respectful. Not because he was powerful. But because she was certain. As she stood beside him, she understood something she hadn't before. Equality isn't sameness. It's consent. It's the ability to choose how much of yourself you offer, and how much you accept, without coercion, fear, or illusion. Love didn't erase imbalance. It acknowledged it. And then refused to let it decide everything. Years later, when people asked how they made it work, she never mentioned titles or wealth. She talked about agreement. About boundaries. About choosing each other without erasing themselves. And when she looked back on the life she had feared settling into, she realized something quietly profound. She hadn't chosen security. She had chosen agency. And that, she learned, was the only foundation strong enough to hold both love and power. Some stories don't end when the screen goes dark. They stay. If this story stayed with you, even quietly, then you're already part of this space. Subscribe if you want more stories about love, power, class, and the choices we make when no one is watching. And if you have a thought about her choice, about his truth, or about what you would have done, leave it in the comments. I read them all. This was one story. More are coming.